So in the last lecture, we talked about values and variables. Now, in every programming language, values can have different types, depending on the type of data that we want them to hold. And we already saw strings and numbers, but there are actually more data types. So let's now take a look at all the types that we have in JavaScript. And first of all, in JavaScript, every value is either an object, which looks something like this, or a primitive value. So a value is only a primitive when it's not an object. And we will learn all about objects later, but for now, let's really focus on primitive data types. So there are 7 primitive data types: number, string, Boolean, undefined, null, symbol, and BigInt. So let's look at them one by one. First, we have the number data type. And numbers are always so-called floating point numbers, which means that they always have decimals, even if we don't see them or don't define them. For example, the 23 value that we have here is exactly like having 23.0, but they are both simply the number data type. In many other programming languages, you will find different data types for integers and for decimals, but not in JavaScript. All numbers are simply of the type number. Okay? Next up, we have strings, which are simply a sequence of characters. And so they are just used for text, as we already learned. And always put them in quotes, no matter if double quotes or single quotes. Otherwise, JavaScript will actually confuse them with variable names. The Boolean data type is essentially a logical type that can only take one of the logical values, true or false. In other words, a Boolean is always either true or false. Alright? We use Boolean values to take decisions with code, as we will see later. And these are the 3 most important data types that we will deal with the most. But there are still 4 more, which might be a bit more confusing. So first, undefined is the value taken by a variable that is not yet defined. And the variable that's not yet defined is simply just a variable that we declared, but without assigning a value. For example, like this children variable here. So basically, we can say that undefined means empty value. Then there's also null, which is actually pretty similar because it also means empty value, but it's used in different circumstances. But for now, don't worry about the details. I just want you to know that null also exists for now, okay? Anyway, next we have symbol, which was introduced in ES 2015. And this data type is not really useful for us. It simply defines a value that is unique and cannot be changed. And we will talk about this briefly by the end of the course. Finally, starting in ES 2020, there is also BigInt, which is for integers that are too large to be represented by the number type. So basically, it's another type for numbers, and we will talk about this one in another section. So these are the 7 primitive data types in JavaScript. But there is another fundamental thing to know about types, which is the fact that JavaScript has a feature called dynamic typing. This means that when you create a new variable, you do not have to manually define the data type of the value that it contains. In many other programming languages, you actually have to do that, but not in JavaScript. Instead, JavaScript automatically determines the data type of a value when it's stored into a variable. And this distinction between value and variable is pretty important, because in JavaScript, it's the value that has a type, not the variable. So variables simply store values that have a type. Many people don't know about this detail or just don't care, but this is how it actually works. Now, another important implication of dynamic typing is that later in our code, we can assign a new value with a different data type to the same variable without a problem. For example, variable x can initially be a number and then later a string. That's not a problem at all. And this can of course be very useful, but it can also be the source of some difficult to find bugs, which means errors in our code. All right, so let's now actually see these things in action. But before we talk about data types, let's quickly talk about code commenting. So in programming, we use comments to literally comment code or to deactivate code without deleting it. For example, here, I could write a single line comment using // and then I can describe what this code is doing. For example, here I can say variable name conventions. And JavaScript will completely ignore anything that is a comment. So anything that comes after // like this. Okay? And this can be really useful to kind of divide our code into different sections and to explain what different pieces of code are actually doing in our code. So that's a very useful application of comments, but another one is to simply comment out code that we don't want to be executed for some reason. For example, let's say we don't want this code here to be executed, but we also don't want to delete it. So we can simply comment it out like this. And so if I save it, and then when I reload, this 61 should be gone. So you see, that's because JavaScript is now ignoring this code. It's just a comment. But since we didn't delete it, we can of course bring it back. So we can just delete it, and then it's back to normal. Now in VS Code, we can also automatically create comments using the command / shortcut. So that's command or control / to turn on, and then again to turn off. So that's single line comments, but we can go even further and also create multi-line comments. And to do that, we do it like this. We start a multi-line comment using / and then asterisk, and then we end it with the asterisk or star and then the /. And whatever comes here is then normal code. Okay? And with this, I effectively got rid of this first code that we typed in the first lecture, but without deleting it. And so I can keep it here basically as a reference. All right? And so that's what I'm going to do in every lecture now. I will always kind of get rid of the previous code by using a multi-line comment like this. But now let's get back to the topic of this lecture, which is data types. So in the previous lecture, we already saw numbers and strings, right? So here we have a value, which is a number, and here we have a value, which is a string. So nothing new, right? That's what we learned at the beginning of the video. But we also talked about Booleans, right? And so a Boolean is a value that can only be true or false. And so if I write true, that is then automatically a Boolean value, which is in this case true. Okay? And actually I can also log that to the console. And then here you get true. And you can see that it's not a string because strings are printed in white. And this value is printed in this pink. And so it's actually really a Boolean value. And of course, we can also store Booleans in variables. So let's say JavaScript is fun using the camel case notation that we learned about before, and then set it to true. And now we can log JavaScript is fun instead. But of course, the variable declaration here needs to happen before the log. And that's because JavaScript programs are executed from top to bottom like this. And more about that a bit later. Okay? What matters is that this needs to be at the end. So let's cut it and put it here. You can also get rid of this one, save it, and here we still get true. And so here we created a nice and descriptive variable name holding a Boolean value. And remember that it's actually the value that holds the data type and not the variable. Because I could now actually go ahead and change this to a value with another type. And actually I will do that in a second, But for now, let's take a look at a special operator called typeof. So typeof is an operator just like the plus or the minus operator that we can use to show the type of a value. So let me show you how. So again, we use console.log because we actually want to see the result of this operator in the console. So typeof, and then let's say just true. Okay? And more about how operators actually work and what they are a bit later in this section. For now, let's just see what happens when we reload this. And we see that it's a Boolean. So just as I said, the result of using this operator here on a value will be a new value, which is a string with the type of this value here. Okay? So let's do that again here. I will copy it just a couple of times. Just like this to make it a bit faster. And so here, let's use JavaScript is fun. And so this should also be a Boolean, but just to make sure. Here, let's now use a number and finally a string. So just to prove you that these are actually numbers and strings. All right. And indeed, we see that JavaScript is fun is a Boolean, 23 is a number, and Jonas is a string. And speaking about strings, I just want to quickly emphasize that we really always need to use quotes in order to create a string. Okay, let's actually show that here in the console. So we can use double quotes or single quotes, but we really do need quotes in order to create a string. So Jonas, for example, is a string. Okay, and so is Jonas with single quotes. But if we do it like this, then it's not going to work. So it needs to be the same at the beginning and the end. But without any quotes at all, JavaScript will see this as a variable. And so then we get this reference error, which is saying that Jonas is not defined. And that's because it's looking for a variable that does not exist. We never declared a variable called Jonas, right? And so that's why we get this error here. So when you need a string, don't forget the quotes. This is a mistake that I see beginners make all the time, and so really be careful about that. Now, moving on, let's actually see dynamic typing in action. And remember that dynamic typing simply means that we can easily change the type of a value that is held by a variable. So that sounds a bit fancy, but it's really as simple as this. So we already have a variable called JavaScript is fun. And so let's now reassign that variable. So we do that like this. So we write the name of the variable, then equal, and then a new value. And what matters is that we do not write the let here again. So this let keyword. So the first time that we declare a new variable, we need to do it using let. But then when we want to change the value of the variable, we simply write it again like this, but without the let. So we simply assign a new value here to this already existing variable. And this is actually the first time that we did that. And so it's important to understand what happened here. Okay. So again, we first declared a new variable with this name and assigned it this true value. And then down here, we changed the value that is in the variable. So using the box analogy from before, it's like initially putting a book in a box and then later taking the book out of the box and instead putting a phone in the box. And so just like here, we changed the content of the box. In our example here, we changed from true to the string of yes. Okay, and now let's just grab this piece of code here so that we can see that dynamic typing actually works. So if I reload now, then let's see, well, we get here from line 34. Let's actually simplify this here a little bit. So commenting out this code, and I'm using command or control /. Let's reload again. And so you see that initially the type of JavaScript is fun is a Boolean, right? But then we change it to a string down here. And so indeed, when we then test the type of the variable again in line 39, then we get the result of a string. All right? And that basically is dynamic typing. Great. And now let's see an example of undefined. So remember that number, string, and Boolean are the most used data types. But there are more, like undefined and null, and also symbol and BigInt. But in this lecture, I'm only gonna talk about the 3 most important ones, and then also undefined and null. So remember that undefined is the value taken by a variable that is not yet defined. So basically undefined means an empty value. So it's perfectly legal in JavaScript to do this. So to define a variable without a value. And if we now take a look at this variable, then we should see undefined. And actually, let's also check the type so that I can show you something. Year. Okay. And so you get both undefined. What this means is that whenever we declare an empty variable, the value of the variable will be undefined and the type of the variable is also undefined. Now that maybe sounds a bit confusing, but it's really not. So simply put, undefined is both the value and the type of the value. And undefined is different than other types in this way. But this detail is not really important. What matters is that when you declare an empty variable like this, it will automatically hold the value of undefined. And that's why we get undefined here. Then, just like before, we can also reassign this variable basically. So we can now go ahead and say year 1991. And once more, without the let, because we are not creating a new variable. We are simply assigning a new value to year. So it used to be undefined, right? As we just discussed. And now I'm changing it to 1991. And so if I test for the type now again, it should now be a number, right? So let's check that. And indeed, we can again see the effect of dynamic typing. Great. And now finally, just to quickly finish, I want to show you an error that exists in the typeof operator. So all I'm going to do here is to quickly say console.log typeof null. So remember that null is just another data type and it's similar to undefined. And it's also similar in the fact that both the value and the type of the value are null. Okay? Now about this bug, JavaScript says that the type of null is an object. And this doesn't make any sense at all. And so this is regarded as a bug or an error in JavaScript. However, this bug is never corrected for legacy reasons. But null is of course not an object. This should return null just as typeof undefined returns undefined. So just keep that in mind when working with typeof, but we will also come back to this later in the course to make sure that you don't create any accidental bugs because of this weird behavior. Okay, and that's all I had to tell you about data types in JavaScript.